Greetings. My name is Kate Rademacher, and we're here with Writing for Your Life and Compassionate Christianity. I'm really delighted to have Dr. Camden Morgante here. Camden has written a new book about purity culture, which I think is just a really important and relevant topic for many, many of us. We're looking forward to the conversation. Dr. Camden, can you just start by telling us a little bit about your background, your professional background, and what led you to write this book?
Yes, it's a pleasure to be here, Kate. Thank you for having me. And like you said, I'm Dr. Camden Morgante. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist living in Knoxville, Tennessee. And what got me started in writing this book was my own personal experience growing up in purity culture and realizing how it affected my faith, how it led to my faith deconstruction. And then as I became a therapist, beginning to see how it was starting to affect my clients. So that the first book idea started in like 2017, shortly after I was married, and when public discourse about purity culture was kind of picking up, some criticism of it was kind of starting around that time. But it wasn't until like about 2020 that I really started seriously putting together this book proposal and writing and speaking about purity culture online and on podcasts and then eventually started coaching practice for purity culture recovery so that I could expand just beyond my local therapy practice. Yeah, so it was really birthed out of this unique vantage point I felt like I had as a psychologist who professionally is helping people heal from the effects of purity culture, and then just as a person who grew up in this culture myself. So my personal and professional experience kind of came together in this book.
Thanks for that. And for those who aren't familiar with the phrase purity culture, or perhaps confused about what it means, could you just start by defining it and then perhaps talk a little bit about how your book addresses it overall?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I define purity culture as a largely evangelical movement that peaked in the 1990s to 2000s that attempted to persuade young people to avoid sex before marriage using shame and fear as tools of control. So, while the belief or the teaching of abstinence before marriage, that's one that's been held by many religions across many time periods. So, that's not new. But the cultural movement that we call purity culture was really more of a newer movement that, like I said, peaked kind of when millennials like myself were growing up. We're in high school and we're exposed to abstinence only sex education in the public schools. This culture that built up around purity culture that involved rings and books and rallies and true love waits pledges and even like purity balls, things like that. So yeah, so it was the whole culture that built up around it. And then the other thing that I distinguish it as is the last part of the definition that it uses shame and fear as tools of control, that it wasn't just the choice or the belief or the teaching of abstinence, it was coerced through shame and fear. So, a lot of what the book addresses, I start with defining purity culture, talking about how it presents as a form of religious trauma for many people that grew up in that community and the patriarchal roots of purity culture. I go into kind of the historical, sociocultural movements that led up to purity culture, how it was a reaction to what was going on in our culture, all with the undercurrent of patriarchy. And then I spent a lot of time in the book identifying and tearing apart 5 myths that I've identified about purity culture, kind of distilling all of the teachings down into these 5 prominent myths. And I describe the effects of the myths on what the research shows, if there is research on it, or what I see in my clinical practice or in interviews that I did for the book. And then kind of trying to rebuild what's the truth or what's a healthier framework to look at this. So the last section of the book is all about reconstructing one's faith and sexuality. How do we move forward from this? How do we find the path forward from the myths and the shame of purity culture to a healthy, holistic, and robust faith and sexual ethic to healthier relationships, whether we're single or married, whether we're parents? There's a chapter on parenting. So, a lot of rebuilding in that last section of the book.
And I don't think you've said the title of the book yet. Can you hold it up and maybe read out the full title for us?
Sure, it's called Recovering from Purity Culture, Dismantle the Myths, Reject Shame-Based Sexuality, and Move Forward in Your Faith.
Thanks. And you know, as you mentioned, you have a sort of unique vantage point, both as someone who is has lived through this cultural experience and also who is a clinical psychologist. And so, can you just talk about some of the ways you've seen this play out in your clinical work, in your professional work?
Sure. Yeah, predominantly I work with women and couples, heterosexual married couples mostly in my coaching and in my therapy practice. And some of the common themes I see are a lot of sexual shame, whether people are male or female, whether they had sex before marriage or didn't. There just seems to be a lot of body shame and a lot of shame about one's sexuality associated with purity culture because of the damaged goods myth is what I call it, because we were often told you're damaged goods if you do have sex or if you go too far, even if you're sexually abused by no fault of your own. So that leaves people with just this sense that their body is sinful and shameful, that sex is gross and dirty even after they get married. And I noticed that as I was doing work with people on these issues, I was trained in cognitive behavioral therapy in grad school, which is a common therapy. A lot of people have heard of CBT, where you identify and challenge negative thoughts and beliefs. And the idea is that if we can just change your beliefs, then it changes your emotions, it changes your actions and how you respond. So that will create like a total shift for people. But I began to realize that's really not enough when it comes to the shame of purity culture because it can present as a form of trauma for many people. And trauma, the body keeps the score, as we now know. Trauma is very embodied and embedded into our bodies and the way we react. So for many of my clients, they know that these myths were false. They know it was untrue, and they often know like what the truth is or what the right thing to believe is, but they just can't seem to get their bodies caught up with that. So I thought we need more than just a mindset shift. We need this holistic mind, body, heart, and soul integration. We need all of those for a mind, heart, body, and soul on the same page and align in order to truly experience healing.
Thanks for that. And you know, you also mentioned in your opening remarks just the way that that you've gone through your own faith journey, of course, and that this has been a part of that. So can you talk a little bit about how purity culture has affected your own faith life, if you feel comfortable sharing about that?
Mhm. Well, I guess I better be comfortable with it, Kate, because it's in the book. So, and I have to talk about it in every podcast interview. So I've had to get more comfortable because, as a therapist, it's not something that I share with my clients. So I'm not used to that level of vulnerability, but I've had to get comfortable with it now. To share that I really bought into purity culture. I believed in it. I wore a True Love Waits ring for quite a long time. I was really a proponent of it growing up in this culture. But then I found that, again, these were myths that didn't pan out for me. I call them false promises because I was told, I was going to have a fairy tale marriage, get married really young to my first love, never have my heart broken as long as I followed the rules. I felt like I did that and was in a devastating breakup, went through a devastating breakup, was heartbroken, and spent most of my 20s single. I did eventually meet my husband and get married at about 30, which is a normal age overall. But here in the South and in conservative Christian culture, it was is a little on the older side. To the point of today, people will say, "How long have you been married?" or "How old are your kids?" And I'll tell them, and they're like, "Oh, you must have gotten married old." Like it's just kind of an unusual thing in my cultural context. And for me, I just had a lot of pain and a lot of heartbreak through my singleness. And I had a lot of faith disillusionment too, a period of time of distrust of God and a lot of doubts, and realizing that so much of what I've been taught about following the rules, like my whole faith was just built on believe these right beliefs and do these right things, like follow the rules. And that's what being a Christian is. And that's why I say I went through this period of deconstruction. And I've come to realize and believe that like we're never done deconstructing and reconstructing our faith. Because it's at one point I thought, well, I've reconstructed now, but now I'm like, actually, there's still some things to deconstruct. There's still some things I'm working through and rebuilding, and that's okay. That it's kind of a lifelong journey. Um, but yeah, so post the initial deconstruction, at least, I feel like I have a more robust faith that is more nuanced and gray rather than black and white, less judgmental of others, less like more open to people arriving at different beliefs than me. And I tried to bring that same spirit of openness and acceptance into the book of not judging where people are or where they may land and how it might be different from me and where I land, but offering people tools for their own healing, questions to think through, and kind of skills to support that journey.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And maybe just to pivot, I think one of the things I observe is that we really sort of lack a Christian sexual ethic that is healthy and affirming. Um, and so my question to you is, do you see that out there? Like, is there a model of healthy, uh, positive Christian sexual ethic available to us, or is that something that's needed in the field?
Yeah, I think what I see it as is, again, avoiding the black and white and avoiding the extremes and finding a sexual ethic that is congruent with our values and our beliefs and our faith. So in the book, I kind of compare and contrast the two extremes, which are an ethic of shame, which is purity culture to me, and an ethic of consent, which is the dominant one right now in our culture of just like as long as it's consensual, as long as it's legal, that's all that we really need to have a healthy sexual ethic. And while I think that is necessary, I don't think it's sufficient. Like I don't think that's all that we need in order to build a healthy sexual ethic, especially a Christian one. And so I offer just a lot of questions for readers to think through. What are your exploring your theologies that may provide a foundation for your sexual ethic, exploring what your values are outside of your theology or religion, and considering various different sources of truth so that you can do this journey of reconstructing your sexual ethic yourself. But I do think it is possible, and I offer, several examples and encouragement in the book of it is possible to hold on to your faith and your identity as a Christian and heal from purity culture. It's even possible to heal from purity culture and come out on the other side still holding on to what looks like a more traditional Christian sexual ethic. But the reasons for it may be different. And it wasn't coerced or controlled through shame. It was something that you chose for yourself and that you believe to be good and true and beautiful in your heart. So that's the difference to me.
Thank you. And you mentioned earlier about the linkages with trauma and The Body Keeps the Score, which is of course a well-known book now. Um, can you just say a little bit more about trauma recovery and purity culture and sort of what strategies or tactics you recommend?
Sure. Yeah. The reason why I conceptualize it as a form of trauma for some people, not everyone, because not everyone goes through the same trauma stressor and comes out with PTSD or with a trauma response in their body. But for many of the clients I work with, they would identify purity culture as a form of trauma and or they recognize a trauma response in their bodies, meaning that they react towards sex almost as if they've been through sexual assault or sexual trauma. I've had clients say, I've never been abused, but yet it's like I'm acting like I am. Like that's how afraid of it I am, or ashamed of it I am, or just kind of repulsed. And I'll tell them that makes so much sense because in the research, the symptoms and the presentation of people who've come out of purity culture look very similar to the presentation of sexual assault survivors. So that's really why I consider it a form of trauma because of how it affects the body and not just staying in the mind, staying in your beliefs. And then you were asking about like strategies and tactics for that. It's really rebuilding a healthy mind body connection and integrating those. I use a lot of mindfulness meditation in my practice. I think that's something that you do too. Mindfulness, or you're familiar with. And that helps people to just notice their thoughts without having to react or judge them, and also to get in touch with and pay attention to their body sensations. Just non judgmentally observing the sensations of your body, your emotions, your thoughts, all of those helps you to start to create a healthy relationship with your body and to really be present in your body, which is what embodiment is. purity culture is a very disembodied belief system. It really divorces your mind from your body, making you kind of enemies with your body, because you have to fight against sexual urges or temptations, or not being a stumbling block to other people. And so being able to be embodied and accept your sexuality while still staying within your values and whatever that looks like for you, that's part of the strategies for healing that I believe in.
Well, thank you so much. This is a really interesting conversation. If we can maybe just pivot and, as we were talking about before we started recording, a lot of our listeners are part of the Writing for Life community and are currently authors or aspiring authors. And so I know your book is being published by Baker Books. And if you could just perhaps share a little bit of lessons learned from the writing and publication process, any surprises or insights you have that might be useful to others.
Mm. I think a surprise is how long the process is. We think, oh, it's from when you sign the contract to when the book comes out. Well, I signed the contract, about a year and a half before the book comes out. But like I said, for me, this idea started in 2017. The writing and signing with an agent, writing the proposal was 2020 through 22. Like it's been a slow process. And some of that is, the fact that I work a regular job too and have a family. I had a baby in the middle of all that. So that delayed things. But yeah, it's a slow process to really think through these issues, to listen to your audience. And that's why doing the work of building a platform, as we all hear about, it feels like such a negative thing. It feels like such a chore. And it certainly did feel like that to me too. When I signed with my agent, it was January 21, and she said, well, I want you to have a certain number of followers and email subscribers before we can pitch this. Like had an initial book proposal, and I was like, really? I have to dance on TikTok or something, but which I've never done. I have found my own way to build a network and build a community without doing things that feel just not me, like dancing on TikTok. But yeah, doing that was so important to the conceptualization of this book because it allowed me to hear from my clients and my audience. That's really where this conceptualization of purity culture as trauma came from. That wasn't something that I originally came up with myself. That was really of listening to my clients and seeing how this is affecting them. And then also listening to what kind of book do people need and not need. People didn't need another book that told them what to believe about sex or what the Bible says about sex or how to live out their sex life. People really needed a book with the mind body integration parts that I feel like that I could offer, and that they maybe weren't getting in other places. So that changed kind of the focus and direction of my book. So although it took longer than I expected, I'm glad because I feel like I came out with a book that's going to be more useful to my audience, ultimately. So that was a surprise, just how long it takes and the importance of networking. I think having those connections with other authors was really helpful to getting me a book contract, and has been helpful to start sharing and promoting it, maintaining those connections and putting yourself out there. But also, it's surprising how vulnerable it is, as I kind of hinted at earlier. We're used to doing this work, just kind of me and my computer, and it's very vulnerable putting your story or your thoughts or your opinions out there and literally offering this up for people to judge in the form of Amazon reviews or something like that. Yeah, so having kind of a thick skin with that, but a tender heart, and having good support and being grounded in my real life, all of those tools have been helpful for me.
And I really agree with all of those comments. I think including the length, how long this process takes, and every step is slow and involved. And so, being realistic about that. And I do think, your last comment about staying connected to other writers and making connections and community is so important because it is a long and often lonely process and vulnerable process. So, well, now that the book is coming out next month, right? It's coming out October 2024. Congratulations again.
Yes.
What do what do you hope for the book? What is the impact you're hoping for, or what audiences, what groups of people do you hope I hope that it
Mm-hmm.
will reach. And I know one of those groups might be parents, so you maybe can say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think my primary audience is mostly millennials like myself, and you get some of Gen X and Gen Z with that, who live this out themselves and who are trying to figure out sex and faith and relationships in their marriage and in parenting. We're all, many of us are at that stage where we're wondering, what do I teach my kids? Because I know purity culture didn't work, but that ethic of consent, just as long as it's legal or it's consensual, it's fine. Like that's not what I want for my kids either. I want more than that for them. But what do I teach them without making them feel like their bodies are dirty or shameful? So yeah, so I think I want it to be just a really healing and helpful resource for that audience and for other audiences too, people who weren't affected by purity culture, but are curious about how others were and want to understand the unintended impact of it. Or for therapists like myself who are working with these clients and wondering how to help them or wanting to understand the worldview. Or pastors and people who are responsible for discipling the next generation. That includes parents too, of who are wanting a better way. So yeah, so I hope my hope is that people can see we don't have to lose our faith, because purity culture was so damaging. We can hold on to our faith and our identity as Christians, and we can heal from the trauma of purity culture.
Well, thank you. I think this is such an important conversation, and as you say, there's a generation or plus that has been so deeply wounded and harmed by this, and so I'm really grateful that you're speaking out and speaking up. Um, can you just tell us, sort of, as we wrap up, like where can we learn more about your work and connect with you online? And it doesn't sound like you're dancing on TikTok, so I
No,
won't look there.
no, I am not on TikTok. Yeah. But no, you can find me on my website, drcamden.com, or on the other social medias, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, those at Dr. Camden. And the book is, I'll hold it up again, Recovering from Purity Culture by Baker Books. And it releases October 15th. So you can get that wherever books are sold. And yeah, I'm really grateful for the role that Writing for Your Life has played in this journey for me too, giving me some of the first trainings on the business of being a spiritual writer and how to kind of get started on social media and how to even make memes. That was, all of that was so brand new to me. It was a whole new skill set to learn. I was trained as a psychologist, not a graphic designer or, a marketer or things like that. So I'm really grateful for the role that Writing for Your Life has played and just the wonderful community that you and Brian have built.
That was a great class that Brian Elaine offered, which I know has taught so many of us some of the important basics of being an author. Well, before we wrap up, is there anything else you want to share about the book, about purity culture, and or about writing and lesson learned or advice you have? I know that's a big question, so you could break it down into
Yeah.
both and.
Mm-hmm. Um, I think knowing your audience is key. And I think knowing that you don't have to be a published author to be a writer. I heard that before, and I guess it's easy for me to say now that I am a published author, but the writing that you're doing on Substack or on your email list, your blog, or just in your own personal journal matters too. And the writing that you're sharing with anyone can make an impact. But so don't measure your success as a writer by publications or by books, number of books. Measure it by the audience that you're serving.
Well, thank you. That's a um, wonderful reminder and encouragement. All right. Well, thank you so much. Again, this is Dr. Camden Morgante.